Can you see the entire PPT? Hello?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I can
Entire
see.
PPT, no? Okay,
Yes.
good. So today we move on to our second class, Jai Bhim Namo Buddhaya, to all of you. And this is the fourth lesson in our series of 10 lectures. And today we are going to look at very interesting teaching of the Buddha, but not in a traditional way. We will be looking at it in a way that might be accessible to us today. So, the title of the lesson is Dependent Origination, Pratītyasamutpāda, as it is known in Pali. And if we understand this one aspect of Pratītyasamutpāda, that nothing exists independently, everything arises through conditions. This is in a nutshell, is what this teaching is all about. And the Buddha says that one who understands this dependent origination, they understand the complete teaching of the Buddha. So, where we are in the course, so far we have finished three lessons. So, lesson one was about how metaphysics is ethics in Buddhist scheme of practice and thinking. And in lesson number two, we saw that there is no permanent independent self. And in the lesson number three, that is last lesson, we saw craving turns experience into suffering. And today we are going to see how the self, craving, and suffering arise through conditions. Depending on the conditions, the self arises, or the sense of self arises, or the craving arises, and the suffering arises. And in the lesson following this, we are going to look at how dependent arising or paticca opens into emptiness. So this is going to be the scheme of our lessons, and this is where we stand today. This is our philosophical movement so far. So let's dwell deep into it, and just to give you a pictorial representation of what we have been doing, I just brought this image here. So let's go further. So the central question is begin with existence, not with terminology. I'm not going to deal with terminology. We are going to look at our experience, our day-to-day life. So the question is, how do persons, experiences, institutions, and suffering come into existence? I think this is a very important question. This is the most important question. So, traditionally, the Paticca is taught in terms of the links, that there are 12 links, and it's taught in that way. But what we are going to do is what had to be present for this to arise. We are going to look at the conditionality as one of the uh, English translation of the word Paticca is known as is conditionality. So depending on conditions, certain things arise, and depending on conditions, certain things cease or passes away. So this is the central question. We are not going to begin with any metaphysical inquiry. We are going to begin with the persons. We are going to begin with experiences. We are going to look at the institutions and even the suffering as to how it comes into existence. So, we are not going to, as I said, much more about the links, which is known as, it will be clear to you as we go further. So, this is the master insight. And I think this is the statement that we all must remember. So, if we are practicing Buddhist, or you are learning Buddhism, or in whatever way we are engaged with Buddhism, I think this is a very key to understand. And this is what we all must remember. Nothing exists independently. We cannot see that there is anything in the world which exists on its own. So I think this is a very insightful statement, that nothing exists independently. So everything as it were dependent on certain causes and conditions, and everything arises, persists, and changes through conditions. So everything, there is no exception to this law. Everything arises, persists, and changes through conditions. And this is very important. Conditioned does not mean unreal. Isn't it? Sometimes we mistake that everything changes, that means it's unreal. The Buddha never says that. So conditioned does not mean unreal. Conditioned means changeable. I think that's a very important thing that we have to understand, that everything changes constantly depending on the causes and condition. This is the key insight of the Buddha, which we are going to study today. So I think this is the master insight that we need to keep in mind, that nothing exists independently. Everything arises, persists, and changes through conditions. Condition does not mean unreal. Condition means changeable. I think that's a very key insight that we have to bear in our mind. So let's start with any ordinary experience. And I think, this is going to be the key as to how you can understand conditionality before naming it. Okay, so just to stimulate your thinking, and then we will open up for 2-3 minutes of this. So we'll not discuss a long. I would request all of you to be very brief because we have to finish the class in 1 hour. So, a thought appears, then, in our mind or in our brain, a thought appears, an emotion intensifies, a reputation is formed, money acquires value, caste reproduces itself, a person says, this is who I am. So, this is how, we can see the conditions, right? So, we all can, relate with this, that, a thought arises in our mind, or sometimes suddenly, or, depending on the conditions, and even the sudden is conditioned. An emotion intensifies, depending on condition, a reputation is formed. So you see, this is what we are, up to. So let's look at this as to, we will have brief 4 minute discussion on this as to where do you see conditionality in your life. Okay, so any of you, let's be brief. So do you see conditioned, do you have any example of conditioned, your ordinary experiences conditioned by, other conditions, or, in some way it is also called cause and effect, depending on this that arises. But before we dwell into theory, I would like you to look at, this, how things arise, how the thought arises, how emotions intensifies. So anybody wants to share anything? If not, I will go further.
Let's go ahead.
Okay. So you see, we have this illusion that the objects are isolated. This is what we think. And the world first appears as separate things. That if we look at the world through our senses and analyze through our brain, make sense of it, we see that, we have this appearance of the world as separate things. And I think this is where Buddhist philosophy goes much deep into how we perceive the world, how we understand the world. And, that is going to be, our forthcoming lectures as to how that happens in our experience. So we generally experience the world as the isolated objects, and the isolated object illusion, as we can say, and the world first appears as separate things. So we see a tree, a coin, a house, a flag, a face, and emotion. Each seems to stand on its own. But the teaching of the Buddha asks us to look deep into that. And it inquires, it urges us to look deep into the things, that whether what we see as independent or, isolated objects, are they really isolated? So, for example, we are going to look into certain examples and see whether they stand on its own or on their own. So, I think this is a very interesting example that we can look into, that the world first appears as separate things. And this is what we experience all the time. We see objects, we see tables, we see chairs, we see everything around us as isolated objects. But if we look deeply, we can see that, they are the connection between these various so-called isolated objects. We see, when we explore deeply, we can see that the objects do not have the independent existence. Rather, there is a causal web that connects everything. This is a very interesting thing, that, when we perceive the world, we see that, there are isolated objects. But when we inquire deeply, we see that there is deep down, the same world that we see as isolated objects, it appears differently when we look much more deeply into it. So, for example, food, labor, languages, climate, family, technology, there is a deep connection that we see there. So, if you look at the first slide, they look like, totally isolated objects. But when we look deep into that, we see causal wave of, connections or relationship exists. So the basic formula that we can bear in our mind, and this is the grammar of dependent arising, and this is what is the heart of the dependent arising. When this is, that is. This is a very simple formula. When this is, that is. From the arising of this, that arises. When this is not, that is not. From the cessation of this, that ceases. This is a very beautiful formulation of Pratītyasamutpāda that we can see in our Buddhist text. The Buddha has taught, this is a general formulation of what is known as the law of dependent arising. When this is, that is. Means depending on that, that is. From the arising of this, that arises. When
Please explain last line. From
Yes.
the cessation of this, that ceases. ये क्या है? इसका विचार बताइए.
It's very simple. Like for example, if the cloud cease, there will not be rain.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Okay. When there are clouds, there will be rain. If the clouds
Okay.
arise, there will be rain. If
Okay.
the cloud cease, the rain ceases.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So this is very important. Like for example, if we look at it in the, if the stanna ceases, suffering ceases. If stanna arises, suffering arises. You got it? So this is the heart of the dependent arising, which goes on like this. And I know I'm repeating this because I think this is what we have to bear in our mind if we have to understand the dependent arising, which is when this is, that is. From the arising of this, that arises. When this is not, that is not. From the cessation of this, that ceases. So this is the basic formula, and we are going to look into that. So this is not a vague slogan. This is this is not something that we have to know by heart, because this is not a slogan. In Buddhism, in all the teachings of the Buddha, what matters is precision. So we have to understand the dependent origination precisely. So, there is some kind of an ignorance that, about dependent origination, which is, it doesn't mean everything causes everything. It's very interesting. It doesn't mean everything causes everything. What does it mean? Specific phenomena arise in dependence upon relevant conditions. Right? So we can look into nature, a lot of examples like that. I'm going to look at some examples today. So specific phenomena arise in dependence upon relevant conditions. For example, depending on the condition of craving, suffering arises. That is a specific condition giving rise to a specific phenomena. It doesn't mean that everything causes everything. Okay, this you have to bear in mind that dependent origination or Pratītyasamutpāda does not mean everything causes everything. It simply means that specific phenomena arise in dependent upon relevant conditions. Okay, this is what is it's about. So let's look at some examples. Example is the flame. A flame is an event, not a thing standing alone. So we all know that, flame is not a thing or, any entity that we can see that this is what the flame is. So flame depends on fuel, oxygen, heat, and continuity of combustion. Remove the conditions and the flame ceases. The flame was real. It was not independent. This is what we have to bear in mind. The flame didn't have any independent existence other than, the conditions which gave rise to flame, right? So this is a very, very interesting example, and you can look at everything in the world. Everything has this nature that, they arise and pass away depending on the conditions, depending on the causes and conditions. Okay. So this is the example of flame. And for example, we know about money. Money is, of course, conditioned thing, and it comes into existence because of certain conditions. Existence because of certain conditions, like money functions through institutions, through contract, and of course there is a trust between the government and the citizens, and its value depends on the causes and conditions. Okay, so these are just example to show you that nothing stands of its own, nothing arises of its own. So a social reality is sustained by condition. This is the example of a social reality sustained by condition. So from single cause to causal field. Now I'm going to give you example of how a single cause can lead to an entire field, causal field. So let's not simplify the complexity. So if a student fails, a simple example is this, that the student failed because he did not study. But if we look deeply into conditions, the conditional analysis asks what educational, bodily, economic, emotional, and institutional conditions were present here, isn't it? So it is not just one condition. There are many conditions which come into play for something to arise or something to pass away. Okay, so this is an example. And conditionality is not fatalism. It is not determinism at all. There is always hope because the conditions can be changed. Okay, if we change the causes and conditions, then whatever arises depending on those causes and conditions also change. So this is what is very important to bear in mind, that the result is fixed in determinism or fatalism, that you have done something, this is what is going to happen, isn't it? But if we change the conditions, that thing which was going to happen might not happen. So fatalism says the result is fixed. Conditionality says when conditions change, outcomes can change. This is very interesting, deep insight. So Buddhism is not fatalism, that we are going to are determined by some determinist law. Okay, so it doesn't mean that everything is fixed. It means that the results can be changed. I think this is a very deep insight of Buddhism. Buddhism is not fatalism. Buddhism is not determinism. There is it is a religion of great hope. That's what Baba Ambedkar said. Buddhism gives hope to the humanity that things can change, the conditions can change, the outcomes can change. So this is very important to bear in mind, that the conditionality is not fatalism, and this is where the hope arises. That's why Buddhism is the religion of hope. So if we understand the Pratītyasamutpāda or dependent origination deeply, then we can see that the dependent origination sharpens ethics. It is not that you can do anything and there will not be result of that. Because we have seen that depending on certain conditions, certain things arise. And if we change the condition, we change the result or the outcome. That's what the Buddha says. So we know the very first Gatha of Dhammapad, if we behave, with impure mind, or if we speak with impure mind, then suffering will follow. But if we improve our speech, if we improve our thoughts, if we improve our behavior, then the results will be different. So responsibility becomes very precise when we study the dependent origination. So we can look at these 4 questions. I think they should always come in our mind, appear in our mind. Which conditions did I create? Which conditions did I inherit? Which conditions can I now change? Which conditions require collective transformation? These are very pertinent questions. These are very, very important questions, these 4 questions. And I think if we look into these 4 questions more deeply, that which conditions did I create? And we create conditions all the time, both positive and negative. Which conditions did I inherit? So, sometimes we inherit certain conditions, like, for example, the culture, the language we speak, the society, or whatever, so that those are the conditions that we are born into. Which conditions did I inherit? Which conditions can I now change? And there are a lot of things that we can change now itself. And which conditions require collective transformation? It's not just about me. If I change, the things change. We might need to have the collective transformation to change certain conditions. I think these 4 questions are very important because they tie up dependent origination with ethics. And I think this is very, very deep analysis that the Buddha has done. And I hope that we will create these 4 questions in our mind. So this is the master metaphor of the class today, that we can look at the whirlpool, and this is a very beautiful image of a whirlpool in the water. And if we keep this simple metaphor in our mind, we can understand the essence of the teaching of the dependent origination. So whirlwind or whirlpool is real, identifiable, and effective. It produces results, but not independent. That is very important. A whirlpool is real, identifiable, effective, but not independent. A whirlpool has form, continuity, location, and effect. Yet it cannot be separated from water, current, river bed, and movement. It is a pattern sustained by conditions. So, one of the deepest insight of the Buddha is that, there are patterns generated, created because of the causes and conditions. And if you are a student of mathematics, we know that mathematics is nothing but the study of patterns. So we see patterns all over the places. We see patterns in DNA, we see patterns in cosmology, we see patterns everywhere. But those patterns, they arise and pass away, cease to exist depending on the causes and conditions. I think if we can bear in mind this metaphor, this is the master metaphor. I named it as a master metaphor for the class of a whirlpool, which is real. We can identify it. It's effective also. It can drown you, but it is not independent. It doesn't have an independent existence. It appears to be independent, but it is not. I'm going to read again. A whirlpool has form, continuity, location, and effect. It cannot be separated from water, current, river bed, and movement. It is a pattern sustained by conditions. If we look at ourselves, as human being, we can extend this metaphor to us as well. So, you see, we have this, we think that there is a fixed identity, but no. Identity is also a stable pattern within change. We know it changes all the time. Our identity changes all the time. Our body changes all the time. That, as we have seen in the previous sessions, our mind changes all the time. Our thoughts change all the time. So, if we extend the metaphor to a person has name, body, memory, relationships, legal identity, and responsibility. This is true for all of us. But not as unchanging essence behind these processes. As we have seen in the previous lessons, that we cannot separate an independent or metaphysical entity within us, which we can say that this is something which never changes. We cannot find the Atma. We cannot find anything independent. We cannot find anything permanent in our experiences. So, and the Buddha talks very beautifully about continuity without independent substance. Continuity with, it says continuous discontinuity. It's a very beautiful word used in the Buddhist philosophy, that one thing leading to another thing. We cannot call it a thing, right? Because the thing is a misnomer. One condition leading to another condition leading to another condition leading to another. But because of our senses, as we are going to look into this, how we perceive the world as isolated objects, because of the structure of our consciousness. But in reality, everything is in the flux. Everything is inherently flexible. Everything changes all the time. So whoever we are, if we extend the metaphor of whirlpool, we appear to be, independent, isolated. But if we look deeply, if we look in depth, we can find that a person has name, body, memory, relationship, legal identity, and responsibility. We do have that, all these things, but there is nothing, which we can point out to as essential or essence, or the thing that never changes, or Atma within us. So continuity without independent substance. So that is an extended metaphor. So no independent self doesn't mean that there is no person. This is the mistake that we do. We think that, the person doesn't exist. Person is also an entity, an event, as we have seen in the previous classes. So this is the crucial clarification that we have to bear in our mind. The person exists conventionally and causally. In the ultimate analysis, there is no person, there is no self, but a person exists, conventionally and causally, socially. We do have a personality. And therefore, our actions have consequences, relationship matters, and responsibility remains. What is denied is independent essence. So this is what is, the understanding of Pratītyasamutpāda at that level. So 3 levels of dependence. If we look at our own existence, then we can see that there are 3 levels of dependence. The individual is already a field. We are already a field. We are not a separate entity which can be taken out of the world. We can never be taken out of the world. Not possible. Okay. So the individual is already a field. So we are depending on our material need. We depend on food, air, water, climate, biology. You remove any of this factor, and we cannot exist. We cannot arise. Then we have psychological, dependence. For example, language, memory, habit, perception, and of course, social recognition, roles, institutional power. So we can see that, we are like intersection of so many causes and conditions. Not just one condition. There are so many causes and conditions that come into being for our personality to arise, and bear in mind that in our personality, there is nothing which we can designate as independent, right? We are arising all the time. We are arising all the time because of the biological reality, because of, we are breathing. If we don't breathe for some time, we are, we pass away, we cease to exist, right? So, we are depending on the causes and conditions. Though it appears that we are separate, isolated object, we are not. We are dependent on so many things for our existence, for us to arise, So this is a very interesting slide. And so this is what we have to bear in mind, because this is a very important point in Buddhist philosophy. The relationship is not added later. We are relational beings, and Baba Sahib's guru, one of the gurus, John Dewey, says that the mind is social. Or a mind that we think that it's independent, it's actually relational. The language we speak, it makes us communicate. I'm speaking with you and you're able to understand. It's itself, relational. So this is a relational ontology. Relationship is not added later. We are all, related. And some of the quantum physicists are saying that the reality relational. The reality doesn't. We cannot find the ultimate stuff. What we find is always relation of this to that, of that to that, like that. So that is how is the nature of reality. So a thing is not first complete by itself and then placed into relationship, right? Relationships help constitute what it is. Reality is process, relation, and pattern. So this is very important, that we do not agree with the substance philosophy. We don't think that there is any ultimate substance that can be found in the world, but we can see that the reality is process, reality is relational, and reality is pattern that arise all the time. So this is very, very deep inside of the Buddha. This is very deep inside of the Buddha, that we are placed and then we are made related to somebody. No, it's not like that. Relationship helps constitute what it is. This is very deep point, but if we can understand it, we understand with the very heart of the Buddha's teachings. And this is what we have to bear in mind. Reality is process, relation, and pattern. So this is the master visual that we can see. So, this is 1 minute. So we see that a person, is sort of related and, comes into existence because of the so many relationship, family and, environment and economy and politics and so on and so forth. And each node that we are, related with, is related with some other node. So, there is this very deep sort of a relationship that is there. So, I just wanted to give you a practical example, a kind of a memory movie that will enable us to understand Pratītyasamutpāda deeply and, maybe permanently. So this is a memory movie, a chain that is not merely a chain. So, for example, there is a spark in jungle, forest, then there is a forest fire. Because of that, the smoke rises. Then because the smoke rises, it has particle around which there is a condensation and the clouds form. When the clouds form, there is a rain. When there is a rain, there, there is a, there is a river, a village. Then there is a child, decision, war, refugee, and compassion. These all, we can see, form a chain. So, a single thing that a spark in a jungle can lead to so much complexities. A small event enters a world of conditions and changes form. So, you see, we see that this is a small event. That is, they say that even flipping of a butterfly's wing can cause the tornado. That's what it says. The small condition can lead to a very complex, change, turn of the event in the world. So this is just to give an example that how a spark in a jungle can lead entirely to flooding, can entirely lead to, displacement. If there is a fight over the water, how those things can lead to wars, and, wars can lead to, as I said, refugees. Then, a child whose future is completely turned upside down. And when, if there we see a lot of suffering in the world, how that, enables us to look into that suffering from the eyes of compassion. So this is just to give you an example. I extend the movie a little bit. A small events meet a prepared field. A spark alone is not the fire. Dryness, wind, vegetation, and terrain participate. The result arises from a field, not a single isolated cause. Then smoke to cloud to rain, and effects transform into new conditions. What seems to be an end becomes the conditions elsewhere. Smokes join atmosphere, clouds gather, rain falls, different system begins. Then rain becomes river, river shapes settlement, settlement shapes family, language, work, and childhood. Nature and society interpenetrate. You see, so natural conditions becomes social conditions. So, if somebody is living in a deep hills, inaccessible from the say mainland, then they have a different the natural conditions give rise to different social conditions. So this is just an illustration to show you that how Pratītyasamutpāda comes into being. So a decision to, enter into war can lead to, fight between the nation, as we see so much of, suffering around us, and personal action, interest, institutions, and power. We can see this very clearly in the today's world, as so many wars are happening around us. We can see how the personal ideologies or the egos or whatever leads to so much of suffering for other people. So this is, if there are refugees, pain does not automatically produce wisdom, but when met with attention, organization, and ethics, suffering can condition compassion, new conditions can be cultivated. So there is always a scope for cultivating the conditions, So these are the 12 links. I'm not going to traditionally approach them. That, there is a formula, Avidya Pacha, Sankhara Pacha, Vijnana, and so on and so forth. I think this just becomes a list. So, there is no point in repeating that. You can anytime read it in the internet. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to explain you the essence of these 12 links, which is sort of, creates the conditions for suffering. And now we can study the canonical sequence, and we will not study it as a dry list, but as the conditioned construction of experience, identity, and suffering. So I have taken this example of a plant here, and I'm going to elaborate a little bit. There is a very beautiful sutta in the Mahayana Mahayana canonical literature, that is called the Rice Seed Sutra, Rice Stalk Sutta, and it's very beautiful sutta. I like it very much. So in the morning, the Buddha sees, from the mountain, Vidhakuta, he looks into the world, and he sees the green fields, and he smiles, looking at a rice stalk. And then Sariputra goes to him, Sariputra Mogla, I don't remember, and ask him, why did you smile? And other disciple asked to Sariputra, why did Buddha smile? And then he explains that Buddha saw in the rice hug, rice stalk, he saw the entire Pratītyasamutpāda. So I'm going to just give you an example of that. So we know that when we plant a rice seed, so depending on the seed as a condition, as a cause, we have the sprout, and the sprouts leads to a small plant. Plant leads to, leaves and flowers and fruits, and so on and so forth. So this is what one leads to another. But because there is a soil as a condition, there is a sunlight as a condition, there is, rainwater as a condition, water as a condition, the seed sprouts into that. So this is the example of causes and conditions. Okay, depending on that arises, like that. But there are conditions. For example, even if we think that we are independent or isolated, but if there was no earth, we wouldn't come into being. If there was no sun, we can't exist, right? If there is no atmosphere around us, we cannot simply be. So, this little plant can explain us the entire Pratītyasamutpāda. If we look at it from the point of view of Pratītyasamutpāda. Everything in the world can be explained, everything. And it is said that the first time a person who understood the Pratītyasamutpāda or cause and condition, he understood the scientific way of learning the things. Because like science always tries to find out the causes and conditions for certain phenomena, why they arise. The Buddha, himself looked at the world and, you see, he didn't merely see the suffering. He tried to find out what are the causes and conditions for the suffering to arise. So this is the movement one, inherited field, that, when we are born, ignorance leads to formation. Ignorance is not merely lack of knowledge and information. It's like misperceiving the thing. We perceive the impermanent as permanent, conditioned as unconditioned, dependent as independent. That's what we see. Non-self as self. Because we see our view is upside down, and the formations are habits shaped by this misunderstanding. So avidya, pachaya, sankhara. So avidya is, of course, not knowing, avidya, not knowing, and it leads to conditionality called the formations. And this is what happens because, we always, because of the ignorance, we do not see the way it is. We misperceive the world, and that's misperceptions create formations and habits which shapes. So then we experience the world depending on our conditions and formations. So then there is an experienced world, consciousness, name and form, six sense basis. So I'm not going to go into the Pali text of it. But if we want to know, there is avidya pachya sankhara, sankhara pachya vijnana, vijnana pachya namarup, namarup pachya sarayatan. But that's not, we have to bear in mind. We have to understand how, we misperceive the world, because we misperceive the world, how that conditions us. That's how our consciousness is conditioned. That's how the naming and, forming appears. And then we have the six sense bases. Based on that, there are six sense bases that arise. 1 minute. Somebody wants to join, so. Okay. Okay. Okay, so this is, we do not encounter a finished world without mediation. Whatever we experience in the world is always mediated by our senses, and experience shaped by consciousness, body, mind, organization, sense capacities, and naming. And that's how the world appears to us, because all our experiences are shaped by our consciousness. And we are going to look at deeply what is the consciousness, how it is structured, and then mind, body, mind, organization, the way our body and mind is organized. So, just to give you an example, the way the dog will perceive the world because of its body mind is completely different than how we perceive the world. And depending on our sensory capacities, because of the sensory limitations of our eyes, we can see a particular, a world in a particular band or in a particular bandwidth, and we hear a particular bandwidth, and we smell a particular bandwidth, as it were. So, depending on our sensory capacities and naming, because we have this language which labels the objects. That's how the world appears. Then movement 3, and because of, the contact naturally occurs with the world, or what we perceive as the world, the contact is always there. Phassa, when there is a contact, phassa pachya vedana, there is a rising of feeling. And when there is a arising of feelings are pleasant feeling, unpleasant feeling, or neutral feelings. Very, very basic Buddhism, but very interesting. So if we have the pleasant feelings arise, we want it. If there are unpleasant feelings, we want to push it away. So pulling or pushing, liking or disliking, which is taking place all the time in our mind. Because, the feelings, there are only 3 feelings. Either the feelings will be pleasant or unpleasant or neutral feelings. Okay, even the feelings are neutral, we have to bring mindfulness to understand the nature of it. And the feelings conditions craving. As I said, that, the traditional raga, dosa, and moha, they are very psychologically, they can be understood very psychology, that if we find something pleasant, we hanker after it, we run after it. If you find something unpleasant, we want to run away from it. And in the state of neutral feeling, it's like ignorance. So these three words you have to bear in mind. There's, I think, very interesting three words that we can bear in mind. That is, raga, dosa, and moha. They arise depending on what we can say, what we can call the 1 minute. They arise depending on the three feelings. Okay, so let's go. I think we will have a discussion at the end, and maybe a long one. So this is that is how the suffering arise, and we have seen that the condition of craving hardens into us, and it becomes so strong that it gives sometimes rise to the neurotic sort of a clinging to certain things, and the experience becomes mine. We own the experience, thinking that this is what is me. So let's return just to recapitulate that in the lesson 3, that is previous lesson, we have learned that craving leads to suffering, the thirst, and craving now we are putting in the larger architecture of the Pratītyasamutpāda. That is not just one condition. The craving arises depending on so many conditions. So this is very important to understand the overall architecture of how the craving arises. So lesson number 3 showed the phenomenology of thirst. And here today, in lesson number 4, we are seeing its conditions. So craving is not an isolated defect inside a person. So don't think that craving is a defect in us. Okay, let's not psychologize it, saying that it's a defect in me. It is conditioned event that arise depending on the nature of existence itself. And that's what we have to bear in mind. So that's why Buddha said 4 noble truths are noble. They are not ignoble truths. So we know that there is a suffering, and there is nothing to be feel bad about it. It arises. It's a noble truth. Okay, so we don't make so much of craving all the time. We know that it produces suffering, and if we remove the causes and conditions that produce craving, we ultimately remove the causes and conditions for removing the suffering. So craving is not an isolated defect inside a person. It is a conditioned event, and this is how we put the craving in the larger architecture of the Pratītyasamutpāda. So then we move on to understand the other levels of Pratītyasamutpāda. Bhava, bhava pachya jati, jati pachya jara mara. So becoming consolidates patterns and identities. So the more we are conditioned by certain things, it becomes our dominant pattern, and it becomes our dominant identity. And the birth here is meant arising of the self position. So here birth of I. So there is a birth of I taking place within us all the time. Birthing of I. Okay, I am attacked, I am superior, I am inferior, I am ruined. Right? So here the birth doesn't mean physical birth. Here the birth of I, ego. Okay, it's arising all the time, depending on the causes and conditions, because we become certain things, and we identify with certain patterns. Rather, we become those patterns, and that's how the birth of a self position arises. So these things will be more clear. So whatever is born through conditions changes and changes. So everything that we experience is born of the conditions, and when those conditions are gone, those things cease to exist. So just to give you an example of our one lived cycle, use this in the classroom. We can use this in the online classroom. That there is a message on our phone. We need to discuss what happened yesterday. So if there is a message from someone, or your boss or your colleague or whoever, or or a person with whom you are in relationship, then you see, if there is a message like that on the phone, we need to discuss what happened yesterday. Then we can have the chain, we can look at the chain unfold inside experience. So if we receive such a message, the world appears, there is a contact. Then uneasiness arises. That's a feeling of unease. Okay, what has happened? See, the message is one condition, not the whole cause. Now, how the message leads to suffering? Then craving, reassurance is demanded, whether all is right or not, what might have been happened, because whether I did anything wrong. You see the birthing of self, And then when that arises, then we have this clinging that I must not be criticized, then becoming I am under attack, and then suffering, anger, fear, accusation, regret. You see how this single message can completely lead to, you know, the whole links of the Pratītyasamutpāda. Okay. So this is just to give an example. So where freedom begins. So this is a decisive interval. Please listen very carefully where our freedom begins. So when the feelings arise, and feelings arise in us all the time, because the feelings are conditioned. So when feelings does not have to be responded automatically, there is a gap between the feeling and our response. So if there, that's why, if you have practiced Satipatthana, the second stage is Vedananupassana. So just become aware of your feelings, that it's a pleasant feeling, it arises, passes away. It's an unpleasant feeling, arises and passes away. It's a neutral feeling, arises and passes away. If we can create a gap, and that gap can be cultivated within us. So awareness changes the condition. Sati has such a profound effect to change our entire experience. This is the very fundamental gift of the Buddha, the practice of awareness that we can all practice at any moment of time. At any moment of time, we can practice awareness. And in this case, if there is a feeling, and feelings have only three shades, it's so so easy to understand and explain, but very difficult to practice, because once the feelings come, sometimes the pleasurable feelings are so overwhelmed that we are drawn towards them. We become completely blind by by the possibilities of that pleasure. So you see, there is a gap that can be cultivated between the arising of feeling and actually working on that tanna. So there is a gap between feeling and tanna. We can create a gap, and that gap can come into being if we become aware, if we cultivate awareness, and the awareness changes the condition. That's a very deep insight of the Buddha. That's the path to the complete freedom. That's where the freedom begins. So I'm not, actually going to go much into that. So there are dependent origination beyond the individual. I think this is very important for Ambedkar and Buddhist to understand conditioned systems. So it is not just about that individuals are conditioned, but also there are conditioned systems like dependent origination beyond the individual. As I was talking about the individual, but let's look at the conditioned, origination, the conditioned system. Like marriage is a conditioned system. Corporations that we work, caste is a conditioned system. Money is a conditioned system. Nation is a conditioned system. And these are real in effect, isn't it? But they are sustained by conditions, practices, beliefs, institution, and power. So even not only individuals are conditioned, but also the systems are conditioned. So this is, I think, a very interesting thing that I'm going to touch briefly. We can do this online exercise. Each one of you can do it. And we begin with 5 questions diagnostic. I called it 5-question diagnostic. We can choose caste, money, corporation, marriage, or nation. And we can look at this from the 5-question diagnostic. What conditions made it possible for the caste to arise, for example? What reproduces it daily? How the caste is reproduced daily? What beliefs make it seem natural? Who benefits and who bears the burden? Where can transformation begin? Okay, this 5-question diagnostic can be applied to money, corporation, marriage, or nation as well, isn't it? I'm going to share the entire presentation with you, so you will have this. But I think if we had more time, we would do this. But let's do it for caste, the model analysis of a conditioned system, a system reproduced through conditions. So we know that the caste is reproduced through endogamy, family organizations, religious sanction, inherited status, property, division of labor, political representation, prejudice, everyday habit, and violence. Abolition requires transforming the conditions that reproduce graded inequality. Okay. So money and nation, I'm not going to go into that, how they are produced. So, this is what Ambedkar write. I think Baba Ambedkar was very fascinated by the, conditioned systems. And all his life, he was trying to understand various systems. And he changed a lot of conditions. The coming of the Constitution of India itself is a big change in condition. And if you imagine India without the Constitution and its values, where we would be. So you see, this conditioned arising resonates with Baba Sahib Ambedkar very much. So conditional analysis and social transformation. So what we have to do is identify the mechanism, identify the institutions, identify the sustaining beliefs, alter the conditions, create new social possibilities. This is a method of liberation, not mere description. So Pratītyasamutpāda is not just to remove our personal suffering or individual suffering, but it has a larger role to play. It offers a method of liberation. It is not just a description, it's a method. So 5 misunderstanding before we conclude, that clear the ground before we close. Not everything causes everything. So we have to bear in mind that not everything causes everything. Nothing is real. No one is responsible. We are all responsible. Not destiny. It is not destiny. It is not fatalism. And it's not just about future rebirth, that some traditions interpret Pratītyasamutpāda as future rebirth. But we can see that, the complete cycle within our lived experience. And dependent origination is precise, ethical, and liberating. So that's what we discuss. So final synthesis: a person is not an isolated event. An emotion is not an independent emotion. A social institution is not, independent. Suffering is not destiny. Each arises through conditions. So this is the final synthesis. And this is the bridge to the lesson 5 that we are going to have. Dependent arising leads to emptiness. And I'm going to show you what is the emptiness, not at a metaphysical thing, but as a very, very deep sort of the, characteristic of reality. If something exists only through causes, conditions, parts, relations, and designation, what independent essence can it possess? Dependent origination tells us how things arise. Emptiness tells us how they exist. So how everything exists, that's what we are going to study in the next lecture. I would think that you carry this 3 question as a reflection home, and you think about this question throughout the week. Like particularly, which conditions repeatedly produce the person I believe myself? Which conditions sustain the suffering I want to end? Which new conditions must be cultivated for freedom to become the real possibility? So with this, we will end and open the class for 10-15 minutes reflection and discussion. Okay.
Hi, Mangesh.
Yes.
Good morning.
Rajesh bhai, yes.
Actually, I hear that discussion, or actually lecture, and a few points I need to discuss at this point. One is awareness, as you highlighted. Awareness is a very deep component of Buddhist teaching, but it is also a deep component of teaching of Mahavira, because there is a very close relation with the Buddha and Mahavira. I think they are two brothers who have a slightly different opinion in the outcome of our life. They are very uniform in the sense, who am I? The question is that कि मैं कौन हूँ? और इस मैं कौन हूँ इसका आंसर में जब when we go deep inside, Mahavir and Buddha are the uniform. They are moving on the same direction.
Okay.
But when it comes, what is the purpose of life? How to act in the society? Here, Buddha and Mahavir differ. And the awareness is the common to both teaching of Buddha and the Mahavira. That is the one fundamental things I want, because the purpose of life of all of us is to know who am I and how I can be a more productive for myself, my family, and my society. I think यही हमारी जिंदगी का पर्पस है.
Right.
क्योंकि और उसका रास्ता चाहे हमें बुद्ध दे, चाहे महावीर दे.
No, not like that,
कोई
Rajesh.
XYZ.
Rajesh bhai,
I'm not against. I'm not
No,
against.
I would like to differ with you here, because the path, both the
Let
paths
me
are very.
finish. Let me finish. Then you talk. So caution is that the special thing about Buddha teaching is that he is giving a very objective, very true, and very meaningful path for our life to be executed for a purpose that have an impact on our society. That is the truth, and that is a fact. And this there because I highlighted the awareness part, because you see, highlight the awareness is very important component of teaching of Buddha. It is fact, but it is also a core component of other philosophies also.
Okay.
Second important part is uh, the rebirth. Rebirth is awareness or intellectual rebirth. Suppose why Siddhartha become Buddha? Siddhartha become Buddha because of his own analysis who the Siddhartha is, and the who Siddhartha is evolved into Buddha. So
Let me
there,
respond to your first thing first, because I think we do not have the luxury of time, because I have to go for a meeting now after some time. And generally, but let me clarify you that, I don't think that the sati is the part of all the religious tradition, the way the Buddha taught, right? The way the Buddha taught
Sati.
sati, what we call sati or mindfulness. Okay. And the Buddha
Mhm.
taught it very systematically in terms of how you can practice the sati, and how sati can leads to, the awareness of reality. And the Buddha begins with a very basic things. Buddha doesn't reject mind and body. Okay, Buddha doesn't
Yes,
ask us to self mortify yourself the way Jains will do. The Buddha is not for self mortification. That's number one. So
I'm
okay.
just
So let me
yes,
let me finish. Don't We are not arguing here. I'm just trying to
yes, yes,
I'm just trying to speak in the
yes,
context of
uh,
our lecture. I don't want to, philosophize beyond what we are doing in the lectures. Okay, because there are other people also who are interested in understanding the Buddha's teaching. So we are not doing here the comparative study at the moment of the religions. Okay, so, but to bring to you a very important thing, that the Buddha placed the entire sati or awareness in the context of Pratītyasamutpāda, and he exactly pointed out from where you can find your freedom from suffering. And I think that's a very important point to understand, that the Buddha didn't ask us just to mortify yourself, to pure your mind. And the purity of mind is a doctrine which comes after. But the Buddha is a very practical, pragmatic teacher who asks us how we can, you know uh, as Baba Sahib Ambedkar would say, move the mind in the direction of the freedom. Okay. So I think there is a marked difference between Buddha and Mahavir in terms of the methodology, or in terms of the Dhamma, or in terms of the path. So very clear demarcation, and you can see in the Buddhist suttas also there is a lot of
yes,
on that.
I'm yes,
Okay.
yes.
So I think we
So
have to
I'm just saying the awareness away.
yes. So awareness, what do you want to say about awareness?
Uh,
What is the point? I'm
just
not getting what is
to
the point?
just say कि awareness is a complete freedom of any attachments. That is fact.
No, 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 no.
Because
Awareness is not, awareness is about, it begins with awareness of your body. Okay. It begins with the awareness of your mind. And you cultivate the awareness very deeply of our emotions also, Vedana. And then the reality itself. You cultivate the awareness about your mental events. Isn't it? It's very, very clearly laid down path in Buddhism. Very clearly laid down path. There is no confusion about, how awareness unfolds the path to freedom. And I think, now you are talking about Jainism. If you can elaborate the path as to how awareness leads to freedom, you
नहीं,
2 3 minutes. You can do that.
I'm not actually I'm not telling about the Jainism, but question is that कि हमें we as a being learn people from Buddhism, or we have a learn aware from the teaching of Buddha. It is important to also aware that there is a meaning of certain things, or like awareness, and awareness is a component of other philosophy also, and
So
it
what?
is also
So
important
what? So
component of
what? Now I asked you a question.
awareness.
Rajesh bhai, wait here. I asked you
uh,
a question that, now I can, completely delineate the path of freedom. How awareness leads to what? What is the next thing? Like, if you can do similarly for the other religions that you are talking, I would like to hear from you as to how Jainism takes it up from awareness to freedom. Please elaborate if you can. We shall be grateful.
yes, there is two different things here from because both Jainism and Mahavir and Buddha.
They
I'm
are
not
not
talking
same.
about the
They are not
we
same.
are not. Yes,
Your
we are.
methodology is different.
Let me finish
So
that.
I don't want to have this
Actually,
discussion, brother Rajesh. I don't want to have this discussion which is speculative. I asked you a simple question as how we can see the path, from sati to freedom, exactly where we can intervene in our lives.
yes,
So if you can delineate that, say for example in other traditions, we'll be very happy to hear.
yes, because from sati, or you can say the awareness or the freedom, because when you achieve awareness, we achieve total complete freedom from the things around us. And when we are completely independent, aware, we can take a best neutral,
Good, good.
best possible decision for us. And the things in us, the awareness we are achieving is from our senses. Because इंद्रियां जो हमारी हैं, चाहे आप उसको ध्वनि कह लो या आईज से के थ्रू या फिर टच के थ्रू, टेस्ट के थ्रू, ये जो इंद्रियां हैं, ये हमारी बॉडी के, हमारे माइंड के अंदर कुछ इंफॉर्मेशंस ले जा रही हैं,
Yeah,
चाहे
but
तो हम
how is that related to the discussion that we are having, brother? Anyway,
दैट्स व्हाई मैं कह रहा हूँ कि
yes.
here the difference is Buddha says कि control these informations, control these senses. If we control these senses, we control our awareness impact. क्योंकि हम अपने ऊपर जो इम्पैक्ट हो रहा है उसको हम कंट्रोल कर सकते हैं और अपनी जिंदगी को बेहतर कर सकते हैं। जैसे कि कोई हम सेंसेस को कैसे
ठीक है,
कंट्रोल
brother.
करें, अगर मेरे को
This was a different topic. We will, when
yeah, that's why I'm saying you raise a question ki how the Mahavira and Buddha is giving a moksha. So it's both are have their own way of doing and the most intellectual way. Because in the journey of
okay,
Buddha,
next
there
time,
is a
Rajesh
good.
bhai, you tell us how sati in Jainism. Okay, let's not speculate. Anyone has anything to say? Anything add to what we have discussed today?
Good morning, Doctor.
Yes, Umesh bhai.
Sir, would you throw some light on the things that we evaluate or see the things absolutely? Rarely we see it absolutely. We do it in a relatively way. That's why the suffering is, sir.
No, as we have been discussing in the class today, that whatever we experience is always mediated by our mind and senses, right? So unless we understand or become aware of how our experience comes into being, unless we become aware of the structure of our consciousness or architecture of our consciousness, we cannot find a way out of our suffering. And as you know, we know that we perceive the world through a very narrow band, as Vibgyor, in the electromagnetic spectrum, our eyes can only sense a particular band. Okay, and only very particular way. And the birds have a very different visual field. And if there's so much understanding that we are getting of the world as to how it has arisen, and all these big bangs and all, there is a very different. We study radio waves. We cannot perceive those with our eyes or senses, but through certain instruments we can perceive them and measure them. So what I'm getting at is our consciousness structures our experience, and once we understand how our experiences are structured, we are free from whatever we are holding on to, right? For example, we have been discussing today about we think that things are having ultimate essence, but in reality there is no essence. The Buddha says that he challenges us to find something within you that is independent, that stands of its own, and we cannot find anything stands of its own in our body and mind. So I think, Umesh, you joined late. Maybe you can go back to the lecture today. I'm going to share that in the class, and maybe you bring your questions in the next lessons. Okay.
Sure, sir. Thank you so much, Doctor.
Okay, so thank you so much. Thank you, Rajesh bhai, Meshram Saab, Mahendra ji, Shruti, Dheeraj ji, Umesh. We will see next week. Okay, thank you so much.